Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he is sitting quietly at a dinner party, the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Calvin Coolidge of Kirch Celta, James Myberg. Flying on Air Force One to London, we have our UK correspondent, the Ronald Reagan of Reading, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Landing in the Rose Garden in Washington on Marine One, the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the James Madison of the National Mall, Richard Tren. And opening his own national park, the founder of France Cranier Private Clients, the editor of the Common Sense, the Teddy Roosevelt of Roosevelt Park, France Cranier. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, the power behind the throne, the Thomas Jefferson of Jeppe, Gabriel Makin. So we have a jam-packed show today, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to start slightly differently because the Social Research Foundation has just come out of the field with its newest survey, and there are some incredibly interesting results to come out of that. So let's start with the top line political results. And there we are seeing that the ANC is that on our 53% turnout model, the ANC is at 37%, the DA at 32%, the EFF at 7, the MK at 8, the IFP at 6, the PA at 4, and then the rest with a 6% shared between them. So, Franz, let's maybe start with you as to what these top line figures tell us about the kind of current state of party support in the country.
Look, I mean, on this stuff you sent it to us earlier, so we're having a look. The ANC and the DA are 5 points apart now. They're both in the 30s. That makes sense. I mean, it's where the drift has been for the last couple of months. And a sort of note we were working on this morning said that is South Africa becoming a two-party state now? And is this perhaps a good thing? And shouldn't these two parties now kind of settle in with each other and realize this is it? They're both going to get to the 30s. They're going to hang around there. And that the best thing is going to be to learn to work together as partners, perhaps even to a greater extent than that they see themselves as rivals. And that if they were to do that, South Africa might actually become politically quite stable and quite successful. Behind these numbers, I recalled that last year in the election, about half of the DA support came from established middle-class suburbia, and about half of the ANC support, just less than that, came from the aspirant middle class on the urban fringe. And if you read these numbers against that kind of support base, there's something you can say, which is that they're not actually that far from each other in terms of the policies that both their respective supporter camps would reward. Because policies that secure a future for the established middle class are very much the same policies that might create a future for the aspirant middle class. And when I talk about the two settling into this two-party state, what we might end up with is a situation where the DA brings the established middle class to a coalition. The ANC brings the aspirant middle class. The policies that both sides want are essentially the same, and they work together effectively, as they've done just over the last week on the mini budget that was such a great success. And the last point, then I'll stop. For the ANC, this also helps it secure its rural base, which is where kind of the other half of its support sits. Because older people in rural areas, they're mostly older, because the kids have left and gone to cities, they're also invested in the success of the aspirant middle class, because they want their kids and their grandkids to see their lives improve to a point where they can get into the middle classes. So this idea that we're now becoming a two-party state, that the two parties actually don't have that much that divides them. They bring two very important constituencies to a coalition, and they should learn to work together as partners, perhaps even more than rivals. I think that's the first sort of serious thought I had when I saw these numbers.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things that kind of has emerged and that I can say is being tracked across multiple different polls, including our own, is that it now seems as though the DA is quite solidly in the 30s in its support level. And this is a recent development, and they are holding there. And it's interesting because in July, which was the last Social Research Foundation poll, we had the DA at 25% and the ANC at about 40% on our turnout models. And so the decrease in the ANC is, it's within margin of error. It's not, it's a little bit, it's substantial. The difference between 37 and 40 is not massive. The difference
You've got to
between
say,
20,
yeah, no, carry on, and I'll say what's important.
Yeah, but the difference between, 25 to 32, that is an increase outside of the margin of error, which means that we can say with relative certainty that the trajectory of the DA from July until now has been upwards, and that it seems as though the support levels are now kind of stabilizing of the DA are stabilizing above the 30% mark. So France to you, and then James after France.
I just wanted to say something to people listening about this kind of data and how it works. The first point is don't think that public opinion on the political party they support is a constant thing, that it's always sits at a certain level. It moves quite a bit, even from week to week. And something such as the performance of a national sports team, or whether where you are in the kind of payment cycle of a month, whether people have money or whether they don't, if the weather's good or bad, the kind of news flow, is there positive news on the country or negative? This will move the dial on this stuff by a couple of percentage points for any party. And the second thing to bear in mind is that there's a margin of error attached to these polls. So on this one, I think it was 4%. What that means is if we, for example, say that a party has 50%, what we mean is that it could be 50, as high as 54, it could be as low as 46, but we're pretty certain it's sitting at the 50 that we're at the moment. And therefore, when you see a move, like Gabriel mentioned, look, the DA in June or July had been at 25, now they're at 32. You can account for some of, if you want to be conservative, which you should be with this kind of data, you could say, well, maybe there's a little bit of margin of error in that, and maybe there are a few other factors. I think a very important thing has been the Inquinazi commissions, which are just so devastating for ANC support. All these revelations of this terrible corruption. So just sometimes we find that people are try to be extremely precise on polls. Like it's why is it now 30 when last month you guys said it was 27? That is the natural order of it, and that's the way that you should think about polling data when you confronted with it, as is the case on this show here. Now, Gabriel.
Yes, to you, James.
Yeah, I just had two questions. Where is the additional support for the DA coming from? And secondly, they've polled well in the past at certain moments of great disaffection with the ANC. And then that vote has evaporated when it comes to the election time. And is it going to be any different this time around?
France, would you like to answer those questions? Yeah. Or
I don't know, James. I haven't looked at where it's come from this time. But the ANC has come off slightly. We're also entering now a local government election cycle. And something I think Gabriel will take us to later is Helen Zille and how she polls around Johannesburg. And I think the opposition always does better, or we know it always does better in local than national government elections. So I think the national psyche is moving towards that. So that might be something here as well. And then James makes the point that that the traditional pattern of things in South African political data is that between elections, support for the DA goes up. And then in the months or weeks before an election, the ANC puts its very impressive campaign machinery onto the streets, and the media runs these kind of absolutely scurrilous sort of hate messaging against the opposition. And the effect of that is to, if the DA's won 3 or 4 or 5 points since the last election, that it loses those, or loses some of that. And I reckon, James, that's going to be the case again, to an extent, but not as much as before. I think the ability of the ANC to put that machine on the streets is not what it once was. And I think the public being receptive to some of these kind of hate messages against the opposition is not quite what it once was. So I think the effect will still be there, but it will be muted relative to what it has been over the last sort of 30 years or 20 years.
Yeah, so James, I will preface this with extending the kind of caution that France already gave the listeners on, bearing in mind margin of error. When we talk about demographics within these, remember that the margin of error extends even further as you go into subgroups within the sample. But from what I can see amongst the data, the biggest improvement that's noticeable for the DA has been amongst Black South Africans. So in the lead up to last year's election, in our polls, it was about 5% of Black South Africans that we polled would support the DA. That number in this latest survey sits at around 15%. Now that's with a large margin of error, but it's clear that the biggest support increase has come off the back of the fact that the DA is increasingly able to get at least a more significant minority of Black voters to say that they will support them in the next election. As to whether they're going to come out and vote, that's a whole different question, and that's almost impossible to answer entirely impossible to answer at this point. But it is kind of clear from the data that the improvement is happening for the DA amongst Black South Africans. And additionally, the biggest improvement, if you look at kind of locality, is in Gauteng, where the DA is now polling just below 50% on our numbers. And again, this is with wider margins of error, but it shows you that I think the kind of take those two numbers together, you can maybe say with some amount of certainty that they are making inroads into the Black urban middle class market that they had previously not had the same level of control over.
Gabriel, you'll remember that last year when we did before the national elections, we asked those questions about why do you vote for your political party, or why don't you, and so on. And if you ask voters that, what you want them to say if you were a political party is, I support the policies of my party and I think it will make my life better. But we saw when we were testing that sort of thing that amongst ANC voters, very few were in fact giving that answer. And when we asked, well, why are you then voting for the ANC? They gave negative answers. So the answers would have been things along the lines of, we're afraid of what would happen if the ANC loses power, that there could be chaos in the country. And a very strong one, I think it was almost 70-80% of ANC voters said the DA, if you give it a chance at government, just a chance, it will bring back apartheid. Because that's what South Africa's media companies had been propagandizing for day after day. And there were fears you might lose social grants or whatever the case was. And I think what's changed between now and then is the DA's been in government and the ANC's lost. And ANC voters saw that, the ANC lost an election, but the country didn't collapse into anarchy and chaos, or at least not. It's a pretty anarchical place many days of the week. It's kind of stayed that. It's also seen that the DA hasn't has been quite kind of accommodating of the ANC. It hasn't certainly not sought to reintroduce apartheid at all. I mean, quite the opposite. And I think as a consequence of seeing the DA in government, the sort of view of it has softened. And therefore the reasons ANC voters were giving, who said, listen, we're fed up with the ANC, but we don't think we can move. I think that many of those reasons have been eroded by the fact of the GNU itself. Now, for some in the ANC, they might say, well, that if you say that, we should get out of the GNU. I'm afraid that's no longer an option, because people like the GNU and the idea of it, and they always have. And if you now pull out of the GNU because you think it reflects well on the DA, you're simply going to give the DA a further boost again, which is to go back to my opening comment, that I think the best thing to do for both sides now would be to say to each other, listen, this is where it's at. We're the adults in the room. Let's realize this is likely the way things are going to stay. I mean, one of us might get more in the 30s, the other might get less, or the high 20s or 40, doesn't matter. It's still the same equation. We need to work together now to make the country a success.
Richard, to you, and then Simon.
So now I had a question on this age breakdown on the topic of reintroducing apartheid. What do younger voters? I mean, a lot of them now will not have grown up under apartheid. Their parents might remember it, but does that message poll much better for older or? I guess my question is, what's the age breakdown of that polling question?
If you give me 2 minutes, I can tell you exactly.
Okay.
We'll go find it. So the age breakdown, there is not really a significant change in your perception of whether or not you think that the DA will bring back apartheid or a version of it as you get older. It's kind of all demographic groups, all age groups are relatively the same levels.
I think another thing that's happened here too, just sort of almost an answer to Richard's kind of idea, or this idea of the DA bringing back apartheid, is that the hierarchy of needs of voters has shifted. And it takes time to do that. And particularly in the urban centres where Gabriel, you say the growth for the DA has been strongest. In somewhere like Johannesburg, I think people are tired of not having water and having to run the gauntlet of corrupt metro police officers and enormous holes in the road. And eventually a point gets reached where you kind of say to yourself, in the greater scheme of things, I actually just want these things fixed. And I've seen Helen Zille a bit on the sort of campaign trail saying something that makes me think that she's onto that. When she said on a few interviews, you don't have to like me to vote for me. You don't have to like my party. That's not a precondition. You just have to want the circumstances in your community to improve, and that's what I'm going to try and do. And I think that's a very effective message for them. And in the end, this all becomes a kind of collective intersection of forces. You've seen the DA in government. It's not as scary as you were told it was. The hierarchy of needs is shifting. The ANC, as I said, of recently has had this terrible news flow of these Mkhwanazi allegations of just the most outrageous corruption every single day, all day, day after day, week after week. And I think as a consequence, I think South Africa is changing at lightning speed, and public opinion is shifting. I mean, I've got my sort of little data sheet here in front of me that Gabriel gave me. I'm just, think back, 10, 20 years, to think we could have a conversation about the DA and the ANC being in the 30s ahead of an election. It's really quite something.
Simon?
Yeah, just a comment, really, that, as it relates to a reflection of the GNU, Twitter fights aren't a reflection. Angry, indignant public statements aren't a reflection of progress. What are reflections? Getting off the grey list. What are reflections is a reception, a pleasing reception to a midterm budget speech. And this, I think, is a very good reflection. So I would hope people appreciate that.
James?
Yeah, it's just a sort of further question is, obviously there's this great discontent with the ANC. It seems the DA is picking up at least some support as a result. Why have the EFF and the MK party not been able to profit from the current situation?
I'll have a go and then you can have a go. Opinion in South Africa isn't radicalized, public opinion. South Africans are very moderate, very centrist in their views. When we've, on previous occasions, tested things like support for expropriation without compensation, less than a third of ANC's voters think that's a good idea. We saw last year before the election, ran a 30-day tracking poll, and when the ANC really stressed the importance of national health insurance, which would essentially be the nationalisation of South Africa's private healthcare industry, it lost as a direct consequence of that, 2, 3, 4 percentage points almost immediately. And there's this misnomer about the ANC and certainly its supporters, that this kind of hard left Afro-Marxist crowd, and they're not. And the ANC's own history of the last 30 years bears this out better than almost anything. Because in its first 15 years in government, when it behaved relatively moderately and fixed investment levels increased and the economy began to grow at 5% and lots of jobs were created, its support went up. And in the subsequent 15 years, when it introduced stronger, more radical policies, and the consequences also of its earlier radical policies were felt in the country, this was the era of expropriation and national health insurance. Its support went sharply down. And the kind of, if you were or to put this another way around, if you were an MK or EFF kind of strategist and you said, well, why aren't we profiting from the ANC's demise? What I might say to you is, well, you've made a terrible mistake. You should have radicalized public opinion, driven deep levels of hate in society, and brought about a steep impoverishment of people, which you could easily do by printing money. And then you could profit from it. But the ANC's demise is not tracking into support for the radical populists, because public opinion in South Africa is sensible, pragmatic, and kind of good. And there's enormous common ground in the views that people, and the values and views that people have on the policies the government should pursue and the like. And that common ground extends across every racial frontier, every historical frontier, the party political frontier, and across the socio-economic frontier. And it's a really wonderful thing. You shouldn't take it for granted, but for the time being, it is a very powerful countervailing force in favor of South Africa's long-term success.
Yeah, and I think just to add onto that, I think I have two additional comments there, which is number one, on the EFF specifically. I've been at the beginning of this year, I had a question because a lot of the kind of polls that have come out this year have shown a kind of decrease in EFF support. And I've been asking this question ever since then, which is, what has the EFF done? If I was a person, like, I'm going out, I'm trying to recruit a person to the EFF, and I'm going to tell them this is what we do. I think to myself, well, what can I say? And apart from, pulling hoaxes and getting, upset on social media and having Donald Trump talk about us quite often, I don't think that there is actually an achievement that people will recognize. And for an organization that's been around for 15 years, you hope, or more than 15 years at this point, you hope that you might have one to be able to say, listen, this is the type of stuff that we do, but they've got nothing. And so that's why I see EFF support tracking down. I was surprised to see that MK support hasn't maintained. We've seen a kind of increase in MK support over this year, and it's maintained levels close to the 14% it got in the national election. And I think maybe the reason why this is happening is because almost all of politics now in South Africa is happening within the bounds of the GNU. And so sitting outside of the GNU is actually, it means that people don't think of you as, actively involved in the political decision making because you're really not. And so before they kind of people will look to what's happening with EFF and MK outside of government, they can actually now look to a real alternative inside of government, set 9 different alternatives to the ANC as options that are being legitimized by their presence in government with the ANC. And so, I mean, I think that that's just taking the oxygen away from the non-GNU part of South African politics. So that's kind of my best, and this is my best kind of guesses, educated guesses at why the EFF and MK support is not has tracked kind of down. You have another question, James?
No, it's just an observation also that in South African politics, these voters and supporters of a party hate it when their leaders are falling out and fighting the whole time. So maybe that's hit hits both MK and EFF badly. I don't know. And another sort of just observation is, the EFF and MK, they started out with a radical message. And was the opportunity that they missed, especially for a politician as talented as Julius Malema, and even Zuma in his own way, is that they didn't then sort of try and moderate to try and win over the sort of centrist middle ground, having carved out having shown that they're not sellouts, that they, part of the liberation movement. Didn't they have an opportunity that they missed to then pivot towards a much more sort of reasonable, moderate message?
France, I think it's probably a question for you.
No, that's exactly right. Because the misnomer is that South Africa is radical populist. We've been seeing some Americans recently, Richard, and some senior ones, and great people. And they've had a hard time on South Africa, and Trump 2 weeks ago kind of quite abruptly said, to hell with your GNU, we won't be part of it. And there've been some requests for advice and what to do. And one of the things we've said to them is be careful that you don't come into South Africa with a preconception that South Africa has been through what you've been through in America and the West, where you have a deep divide between the left and the right and a huge gulf. And you come here and assume you're finding the same thing and you're positioning your politics accordingly. And because if you do that, you're making an analytical mistake about the kind of country. We're not like you. We've stayed centrist and moderate and good, much more so than anyone might have ever had you believe we could be. And there are definitely some people around on the American side who kind of view South Africa as 75% hard left, Marxist, Africanist, enemies of the West. And they might see that as the ANC and the EFF and MK. And then 20% of South Africa, they might say, is like Keir Starmer, which they might see the DA as, which in their view would make them even worse than the Marxist hard left. And then you've only got 5% left, which is the Afrikaners. So they are, as the young Republicans of Texas put it yesterday in a press statement, our sort of fellow Christian compatriots. We must go rescue them from the being besieged by whatever they're besieged by. And I think that is the view on SA in some corners of the current administration in the US now. And it's just an analytical mistake. And if you start your strategy based on a mistake, let alone one as grievous as this, then in the fullness of time, your strategy is not going to succeed. So I think, James is exactly right. That one of the most dangerous things that could have happened here in the last decade was for the EFF and MK to temporarily moderate and be inclusive in order to obtain power. But they didn't have the discipline or the foresight to do that. And the ANC did, in a sense, particularly last year. When it did the GNU, that's what I mean. It's got some wild policies too, but it did do the GNU. And as a consequence, these hard left parties haven't grown despite South Africa's tough economy.
Yeah, I think that that's a great place to leave the question of the kind of headline political positioning. And now we're going to drill down further into some more specific questions. And we're going to start on a topic that we've already, a series of questions that we've already covered from a previous poll in Makin Sense. And that is on these brand recognition questions. So for the audience at home to understand exactly what's going on here, what we do is we say to you, we're going to read you a series of phrases or words, and we want you to tell us which party you think. So forget about your you forget about your loyalty and whatever. Tell us which party you think that this word or phrase describes best. So we'll start with the word or phrase best at providing service delivery. And amongst all voters, about 17% say that the ANC is the best at providing service delivery, and about 39% say the DA is at the best at providing service delivery, and then the other parties get small percentages here and there. When you drill down into the data and you look at the different demographic groups, amongst black voters in the country, 22% say that the ANC is the best at providing service delivery, but 25% say that the DA is the best at providing service delivery. We take that a step further, we go to another question, best at providing clean governance. Which political party do you associate most strongly with this word or phrase? Now again, we've got, it's about 11.5%, 12% of all voters who say that this describes the ANC, and 34% of voters who say that this describes the DA. You turn again to black voters, 16% of which say that the ANC is best at providing clean governance, 21% say the DA. So the DA has now won a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality of being the best at providing service delivery, the best at providing clean governance. We go to has good policies. Once again, amongst all voters, the DA is out ahead of the ANC, 30 to 22. But amongst black voters, the ANC is slightly ahead. But then we go to a set of negative associations. So the question on makes broken promises, who do you associate with this? Now, 73% of voters say that the ANC is described best as making broken promises, and only 3% of all voters say that this describes the DA best. Amongst black voters, that's 70% of black voters say the ANC, 4% say the DA. And then you look at the ANC voters, at the ANC themselves, 53% of the ANC's own voters say that their party is best described as making broken promises. And only 8% of ANC voters say that that describes the DA best. And so you've got this weird dynamic that emerges in which it's something we've talked about before, that the ANC is being left behind by its voters in its view, but that the positive attachments in South Africa primarily go to the DA. It's not amongst a majority of South Africans, but it's amongst the most out of any party. And then when it comes to negative characteristics, those seem to stick to the ANC. And so it's clear that what seems to emerge here is that the GNU has helped the DA's electoral prospects, but it hasn't had the same effect on cleaning the image of the ANC. And so maybe, France, you want to kind of come in here and discuss this a little bit further, what you make of this kind of dynamic that emerges from these questions.
Yeah, I think, Gabriel, we first saw this about 18 months ago. It's a pre-GNU even. that voters were beginning to associate the DA more strongly than the ANC with the positive statements, like has good policies or whatever, and that the ANC was heavily associated with the negative statements. And that's a, you know, that's a fatal position to get into for the ANC, because it means that slowly over time, as your voters have already decided, in a sense, where their future political loyalties are going to increasingly lie. And short of real material reforms, there's not much that you can do to bring them back. And the ANC has moved so slowly. One of its prominent leaders now, I think Mr. Gigabo, who was a cabinet minister, is implicated in some sort of corruption, it's appeared in court. And, you know, it's just absolutely the cliche that ANC voters are fed day in and day out. Another senior guy in court for another batch of corruption. And the ANC's response has kind of been to say, you know, he should step aside from his leadership role. That no longer cuts it in the ANC world amongst its supporters as action. On a question like unemployment, South Africa's unemployment rate officially over 30%, so that's 6 times the global average. To talk about creating a few job opportunities here and there no longer cuts it to bring back that fading support. And you might then make the argument that the ANC's defeat really occurred on the first day that the DA began to catch up to it in terms of positive associations, and the ANC began to hog voter perceptions in terms of negative associations. And that happened many years ago already. And the consequences are now starting to be felt in the country's voting behaviour. And for the ANC to get out of this requires real action, real firm reform, which under its current leader, who's trying to find common ground between mutually competing, some would say annihilating objectives, they're not able to do. And then, if you think about what the implications of that are, it has to be that you continue to see a growth on the DA side over time, slowly perhaps, and an erosion of support on the ANC side.
Yeah, and to continue on that, we go to a next question that relates exactly to what we're talking about here, which is another question that we've repeated, which is about the performance of parties inside of the GNU. So we asked this of the kind of big 5 parties, but we're only going to concern ourselves with the answers to the questions on the DA and the ANC. So the question itself reads, the African National Congress, are they performing very well, quite poorly, or very poorly in the government of national unity? Now, amongst all voters, it's in the most recent survey, about 41.3% said that the ANC is performing very or quite well. So less than a majority think that the ANC is doing well in their position in the GNU. And when you compare this to the previous poll in which we'd asked this question, which is from February 2025, at that point, it was about 58% of all voters who thought that the ANC was doing quite well or very well. So that's an almost 20% decrease in the perception of the performance of the ANC and how well that they're doing. Whereas if you track the DA, they've sat at almost every single time we've asked this, about 60% of voters will tell you that they're doing very or quite well. And that 60% is almost the exact same number every time we've polled this. And so this demonstrates again that the dynamic that seems to be emerging from the GNU is that it's very helpful for the DA because they seem to be doing well. They've now championing a number of different policies which have a wide range of support. And it's not so great for the ANC because now their performance is being measured against another party and people can see that that these DA ministers are plucky and courageous and get up and do things, and they make themselves kind of seen or heard, and there's not the same dynamic that emerges from most ANC ministers. And so voters are looking at this whole GNU thing, and it's starting to look like, what they're seeing is, okay, these DA guys seem to be quite good, and so it's buoying this DA ship while not having the same effect on the ANC. But as Franz points out, it's a kind of a fait accompli for the ANC. They cannot back out of the GNU now that they're inside of it. They need to use it to implement the reforms that generate the economic growth, that create the jobs, that get them back, that get their support levels back. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that's going to set into this GNU if these numbers continue to play out as we're seeing them.
Yeah. I mean, if you just think of the news flows, I mean, let's say you're an ANC guy, you're listening to this, you're thinking, oh, hell, did we make a terrible mistake by going into GNU? No, because your own supporters like the idea very much. And if you double down with the radical left, you'd simply accelerate the reasons why you're below 50% to begin with. But look instead where your problem actually lies. For much of the GNU, the news flow around the ANC has been what? Infighting, squabbling, scandals, corruption scandals, looting on a previously unprecedented scale. That's what people are reading about the party and government, because it doesn't have the internal discipline or the ruthlessness to take hold of its less attractive kind of people and attributes. And what's the DA news flow been? Well, firstly, the expectation was they'll bring back apartheid and be terrible. They haven't done that, so they get a kind of freebie on that one immediately. And their cabinet ministers have been sort of beavering away, and the Home Affairs ministers apparently doing good things, and others as well. They haven't fought with each other. There haven't been scandals about the leadership. I'm sure someone's going to try and arrange some now, of course, in order to try and level the playing fields. But and that I think is very important in why there's such a stark difference here in the numbers Gabriel's showing, with such a very strong majority of DA of all voters perceiving the DA to be performing better in the GNU than is the case for the ANC.
Yeah, for sure. One of the questions as to why the ANC might be losing support and things that we've talked about before has been this question of who precedes this very popular leader in Cyril Ramaphosa. We've gone on at length on this podcast before about how, Ramaphosa's support inside of the party has been one of the major things that's maintained support levels for the party, and that he still remains an incredibly popular figure amongst the party, and that there seems to be no person inside of the party who commands the same kind of respect and admiration that he does. And so we were quite interested in this, and we went out and asked the question, who do you want to be the next leader of the ANC? And we gave people what we thought was a reasonable list of options, being 1, Paul Mashatile, 2, Fikile Mbalula, 3, Josiento Ramaphosa, that's the Ramaphosa who is our electricity minister, number 4, Senzo Mchunu, and number 5, Patrice Motsepe. And so among what's incredibly interesting about this question, just off the top, is that none of these people receive anywhere close to a majority of support. So amongst all voters, it's 13% want Paul Mashatile, 19% want Fikile Mbalula, 9% want Ramaphosa, 4% want Mchunu, and 23% want Patrice Motsepe. So it is between Mbalula, Mashatile, and Motsepe, there's not much of a difference in how much they're wanted. But let's go look at ANC supporters, because of course it's those people who will decide who's the next leader of the ANC, not all of South Africa. So it matters more who they want to lead the party. And so Motsepe was the most kind of popular figure slightly amongst the general population. Now let's look at it amongst ANC supporters. You see 14% say they want Mashatile, 29% say Mbalula, 10% say Ramaphosa, 1% say Mkhunu, and 15% say Motsepe. So now amongst ANC supporters, again, there's no majority, but the clear leader for who they want is Fikile Mbalula. And if I go and look at Fikile Mbalula's favorability, which is something that we looked at in this poll as well, because it seems as though the Social Research Foundation is run by some competent people, at least that's the sense that I get. If you go and look at Mbalula's favorability, his favorability currently sits at just under 18% who see him as somewhat or very favorable. And Ramaphosa's is 44%. So how is this for, the options going into the next leadership election?
Well, they've got a serious problem here, Gabriel. It's almost the sort of first time I'm seeing this set of numbers properly now and thinking about them. When Ramaphosa goes, unless they're able to build one of these figures into a candidate, and then the advice to them, unite around one guy. Don't run a contested election under these circumstances. They have a conference to pick their next leader in December 2027. If they make that a contested race with these kinds of figures, they risk tearing themselves apart. And they risk that from a position which will be about a year after South Africa's local government elections, where they will have done very badly. And if they follow that up with a leadership fight, exactly what James said earlier, they could get themselves into a horrible amount of trouble. And I think their only way out here is actually to build Motsepe into a candidate as leader, to find him a solid running mate, maybe Toko Didiza, and to say we're not going to have a contested election in 2027, and for the ANC's sort of executive committee to give Motsepe the instruction to say, work very closely with the DA and make sure that we can at least hold what support we get into 2029, and then look beyond that to see whether we can build from it. But I'm afraid if you're an ANC strategist and you hear everything that Gabriel's been leading through in this podcast, and how the perceptions have shifted, the negative associations, the limited positive associations, the very positive read on the opposition, and now this, boy, these guys are have a problem.
James?
What about a sort of an option that Mbeki tried and was thwarted with in 2007, and appoint and Ramaphosa stands again as ANC president, even if he can't serve another term as South African president?
It's great that you asked that question, James, because so did the Social Research Foundation in this last poll. And amongst ANC supporters, this is one of the most interesting things. Amongst ANC supporters, 58% want him to run for a third term. So it's exactly that. Because, we presented them earlier in the poll with these options, and I think by the time they reach the question on Ramaphosa's third term, they go, oh gosh, maybe that is the best option. And
James, do you think that's feasible?
Well, there's nothing preventing it, but maybe Ramaphosa wants to just get out of politics and enjoy his billions.
Well, I'd advise his colleagues to lean on him heavily. I think they've either got to build Motsepe up into a candidate, or they've got to consider this as an extreme option. Because otherwise, really, they can, ahead of 2029, they could have a problem. And that does actually worry me, at least. I can't speak on behalf of everyone, because I think A dangerous situation arises where the ANC begins to collapse completely and fall apart. And I don't think it follows easily that its votes just translate into the DA base. One of the reasons for that is the DA base is an established middle-class base. The ANC base is an aspirant middle-class base. It's quite difficult to mix those things up inside one political party. It is, in some respects, a natural order of things that South Africa is ruled by the ANC. Or certainly that it has a very significant role in ruling over South Africa. And I had this feeling throughout last year when people would come by the office and say, can we defeat the ANC, destroy it and grind it into the dust because it's a terrible organization? And our comment always to them was to say, well, if you wish to do that, with what will you replace it? And very often these people said, well, they haven't thought about that yet. And we said, we really have no business trying to influence the country's politics if you can't tell us what the answer is. And so I'd urge people listening to this I'm told that in some of the comments last week, which I don't really read, I was described as some sort of ANC apparatchik or something similar, which is fine. But just to say that there is a very good case to be made that influential people should look at ways to assist the ANC into not collapsing completely, because a complete collapse, which I'm not saying will happen, but if you think what Gabriel's done here, he sort of assembled this collection of forces, and you certainly can't say that collapse is impossible when you look at them now. That I think collapse would be very bad for the country, and hence it's actually the right thing to do for people who have a little bit of influence to actually start thinking about how the ANC can be advised to head off that risk and to remain a serious partner for the DA to work with in forming future coalition governments.
James again?
Well, then is the sort of option that Ramaphosa stays as ANC president, at least for a while, and then Motsepe then takes up the position of deputy president and stands as the ANC presidential candidate in the next elections.
Yeah, I mean, that will make sense. They've got time, so they can do that, but they have a problem in that at the moment they have a deputy leader who by rights is the sort of next in line. And the job of trying to set that right now, yeah, I mean, you're sort of saying the same thing over and over again. These guys have this is a problem for the ANC has a severely serious political problem now.
Yeah, and I'm going to continue. I can see that we're itching to move to some other things, but there's so many interesting numbers, and I want to get the last couple questions across. So, France, you've laid out, we've laid out here quite that the ANC does have a significant problem. And one of the numbers that is kind of amusing that it lays out even further was we asked people, just the whole country, so this is a national level survey, but we wanted to ask this question, and we don't have a survey until next year to do it. And so we said, the Democratic Alliance recently announced that Helen Zille would be the party's Johannesburg mayoral candidate for the next local government elections to be held in 2026 or 2027. Do you support or oppose her candidacy? And so amongst all voters, 7.5% of all voters support her candidacy. Amongst black voters, that's 60% of black voters support her candidacy. And, it's 60% of all voters, 50% of black voters, and 50% of ANC voters support Helen Zille's mayoral candidacy. So, what can we make of that?
Yeah, just the first thing is the way a question like that is phrased. Don't draw from that immediately the conclusion that she's just won the race for Johannesburg, because supporting the idea of her being the mayor is very different to actively voting for her to become the mayor, and these things must be separated. So she still has a campaign to get through, and that will be extremely difficult, in fact, to succeed. This is, I mean, my thought, Gabriel, this is the hierarchy of needs that has shifted profoundly to where you can get numbers such as this, and it points to the desperation of people and how the failure of Johannesburg and Gauteng has been so terribly badly run by the ANC that it's almost become a kind of caricature of everything that's wrong. So much for the world-class African city. It's almost become not the shining city on the hill, but the sort of beacon for the whole country to look to say this is not what must be allowed to happen to the broader society. And she so cleverly picked this to be the next big platform to compete on, because it's the race for Johannesburg next year, when that election happens, or early 2027, will, I think, in the minds of very many people, be the race for South Africa. And what happens in Johannesburg, they will read as what happens to the whole country. And if you needed any further evidence that the country is changing at lightning speed, this most astonishing information you've told us, that's the clincher. That's at least what I think, Gabriel.
Yeah, and to end this very long polling section, and thank you to all of the ladies and gentlemen who've stayed with us, but I hope that you find this as interesting and as important as we do, because it really is one of the, South Africa is not a place that is flush with good political data. And so the opportunity to really get to deep dive into a coherent data set like this is so valuable, because it can tell you so much more about the country than, spending weeks reading through Business Day, News 24, Daily Maverick. But I do tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, that even more valuable information than what's being told on this podcast can be found every day at the Common Sense, at thecommonsense.co.za. But the last number that I want to give to you is because, ladies and gentlemen, because it is something that we have talked about at length, is a number about the DA's new policy. And when that policy was announced, France said that, this is a kind of beginning of a paradigm shift. And we talked at length about how it was so positively received by, almost all of the parts of society that matter. And now we've had the ability to test how it has actually been perceived by the general population of South Africa. And so the question reads, there's two questions I'm going to read to you and go through them quite quickly so that we can move on to the other part of the conversation. But the DA recently proposed a new policy. Its policy suggests that BEE be replaced by an empowerment policy that uses poverty, not race, to determine who's in need of upliftment. It argues that BEE has been abused to benefit an elite few, and its new policy will benefit those who really need it. Do you agree or disagree with the DA's new policy proposal? Amongst all voters, 68% agree with the policy of the DA. Amongst black voters, it's 60%. And amongst ANC voters, it's 61%. Now you look to, and then you follow that on with the next question we asked. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Public procurement spend, in other words, government tenders for public services, should be determined by the value of the contract to the community and not the race of the service provider. So this is essentially two questions that ask about the two parts of the DA policy, changing the definition of a disadvantage and making public procurement spend be determined by value. On the second question on public procurement spend now, 75% of all voters agree with public procurement spend based on value, not race. 70% of black voters and 72% of ANC voters agree with this. And so I think, France, you were completely correct in your read on the importance of the DA policy because it is something that we've known and that you illustrated in when you talked about it. But we've known that this way of approaching empowerment and approaching procurement is the way that South Africans prefer. And the data has laid this out in completely
Well,
unequivocally.
it wasn't hard to know because we've seen this in the data for years, and it's the same point. It's not a radicalized society; it's a moderate centrist society, and the importance of what the DA did on Empire, they also understand. They've got very good data of their own, so they saw this too. And they realized it was a safe move to make. And the people who criticized them, by the way, and said, how can you? You're very dangerous. Of course, every single ANC supporter, they live only for the policy to be continued as practiced. I mean, those DA guys, I think, knew what the numbers said, and they were led by the numbers and their instincts and their principles, and they proposed something. And the significance of it is this, that there's no South African policy that's more important than empowerment. Because what empowerment policy says is it's the policy that determines how does the country deal with the consequences of apartheid. And it was therefore the foundational ANC policy. Of all policies, this is the one. And the fact that the DA now have the lead, a vast lead in public opinion and how the policy should be practiced, is the single most damning thing you could say about the lethargy in the ANC and the inability to see where the wind has been blowing politically here. And it's a fatal moment for any political party when you are overtaken on ideology or policy on either your left flank or your right flank by your own supporters. And there Gabriel's given it to you now. ANC voters have completely overtaken the party leadership on the question of BEE, and yet it moves so slowly to catch up with its own supporters, which explains its very poor political numbers, I think.
Yes, and James, to you for a last comment on this section.
Sure. I just wonder if, I mean, the DA has sort of positioned it sort of politically quite cleverly, but I wonder if their policy would actually work in practice, because it doesn't do away with this very complicated way of scoring tenders. It just sort of shifts it away from a racial basis. And in order to govern effectively, you actually have to award state contracts to the best provider at the lowest price with the shortest delivery timetable. And if you have that, you can that's the means of actually empowering people, because you can build schools, build hospitals, provide services, and do it very efficiently. But even achieving that is difficult. And once and this is the reality that we've had in South Africa on a racial basis, that once you bring in extraneous factors, it just clogs up the whole system, and you end up not really being able to deliver anything. So in practice, if the DA gets into government and they actually apply this policy, will they actually be able to deliver services through private sector contractors easily and quickly, or will the rules that they would put in place actually lead to another sort of clogging up of the whole procurement system?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question, given that, the numbers that we've laid out seem to indicate that the DA might, in fact, have the opportunity to turn this policy into real legislation. So I think it's completely fundamental. But on that note, I think we've done an excellent job, and thank you again to the ladies and gentlemen for bearing with us as we go through it. I hope that you enjoyed your value, and thank you to the rest of the panel for indulging me so heavily and letting me at least have a little bit of a spotlight for this one. So we're now going to the rest of the world, and we're going to start with Simon in the UK, because one of the themes that's emerged from our conversations over these last few months, I think, has been that, South Africa's fiscal position is now seeming to improve, and we've laid out can be easily improved to such a degree that it is remarkable. But it seems as though the opposite is true in the United Kingdom, that its fiscal position has been slowly eroded over time, and it's now reaching the point at which the erosion is going to lead to some, pretty quick fallout. Simon, can you tell us what life is like for the entrepreneurs, the valiant entrepreneurs who are trying to make do with the economic conditions of the United Kingdom?
Thanks, Gabriel, and forgive me. I wanted to wish you all a happy World Toilet Day. I got a notification from the UN. It's World Toilet Day today, so wishing you guys and our entire audience. Nice one. Thanks for that, the UN. It's good to see that you're on top of things. But to answer, just to preface any this next piece on the conditions for entrepreneurs in the UK. There isn't a good story. That's the default position in any reflection of the markets from this side. And if you want a good story, then you're going to have to buy me a team of archaeologists, and we're going to have to excavate back to 2011. But I'm very happy to platform this because it's also, as it happens, our own research relating to a very important point, which is the entrepreneurs in the UK, which we feel contributes a major component of any economic analysis. And this has been done over the course of the last year by ourselves and two other private wealth institutions. And I think you'll be seeing a lot more of it in the next few months and the next year indeed. Not so much now because there are other things which I'll get into, but there are a couple of central points in this analysis of the entrepreneurial environment in the UK, and the first one relates to the non-dom rule, which was for the longest time a very popular rule that allowed any resident of the UK who had a permanent base abroad not to have those earnings from that permanent base taxed. That was scrapped, and it wasn't Labour who scrapped that. It was the Conservatives, and they pivoted to this residence-based tax system. And what happened was that there was an exodus of wealthy individuals, not to the extent that Henley Partners had predicted, but it was substantial. And those guys went firstly to Geneva and secondly to Milan, where Georgia Maloney had established conditions attractive to high net worths in a way that Macron couldn't for Paris post-Brexit, because those rules in France are just mental. The second feature of this analysis looks at the state of the UK economy, and you can see that London as a global financial centre is underperforming and has been for some time, and that's evidenced by 13 IPOs in 2026. And you go back to the Glencore era of 2011, this unfettered wealth creation, and you were looking at 100. So it's underperforming, but this is emphasized particularly for this analysis. Whilst the UK has declined as a global financial centre, the UK as a global financial technology centre, fintech, has largely stayed the course. And that's because in the last decade and a half, you've had some really quite innovative stuff coming out of here, particularly the challenger banks, namely Revolut, Monzo, and Starling, but not just banks. You've had a whole lot of API-driven open banking and other payment innovation. And so that has been really quite impressive for a country this size. It's not going to compete with Silicon Valley. You know, these things are inherently feudal, and there are only a few guys that get to the very top. But for its size, and it's done very well. And the reason it's done well is because the conditions have been created for it to succeed. And there are two things that you have to do to create a condition of favorable entrepreneurial pursuit, particularly as it relates to fintech. The first thing that you've got to do is you've got to give it huge amounts of political support. And I can never credit the Conservative government enough, because they from David Cameron to Theresa May to Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, really did champion financial technology advancement and innovation. The second thing that you've got to do is you've got to convince the regulators to get their feet off these guys' necks. Now, they did that too. The Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, to which I'm registered, is a very, very powerful organ of state. And they are enthusiastic about going after people. But they've turned because there was enough political will to get them to temper their enthusiasm. And I'll tell you this interesting story about this. There's this girl, and she's got a normal job, but she's got a little side earner on OnlyFans. And she got an account at Barclays Bank, and Barclays Bank went, hey, you can't be making money doing that kind of stuff with your Barclays account. The FCA went to Barclays and said, leave her, and this is fine. It's slightly different for the political stuff, as Richard will know. You're not really allowed different political opinions, but if you want to take your clothes off and show the world, then no, it's okay. And then the third feature of our analysis relates to the moment where this started for us, which was last year, and we stumbled across quite an interesting event. Three global venture capitalist advisories shut in rapid succession, and that was pretty odd. And that's our scanning of the market for wealthy people, and we looked into that. And we discovered that one of them was an American, it was the UK office of an American firm that had a limited market scope in the US, Israel, and in the UK. And the Americans dragged them back because nothing was happening. The other two appeared to fall off the face of the earth. And we looked into that, and this is very odd. But they surfaced in Dubai, of all places, along with a whole lot of UK founders. And so what we start seeing now is this departure, not just to Geneva, not just to Milan, but also as it relates to fintech and fintech entrepreneurs, Dubai. And this was particularly interesting for us because we then looked at the profiles of the founders, your average fintech founder in the UK, and we, did an analysis that included how these people see the world politically. And if you do that, you will see that the overwhelming profile of your fintech founder is that they are politically progressive, very much so. They have a liking for state welfare. They agree with taxes. They are about as open border as you get as it relates to immigration. And then on the luxury stuff like identitarian and net zero climate change, they're also up there. And that was very interesting for us because you've got these guys who believe in those things, and then you've got the Labour Party who come in to government last year and also believe in those things. But those guys say, in order to make these things we believe in happen, there have to be trade-offs. And what those founders are having to address now are the material consequences of their value ambitions, and it hasn't worked because that has turned out into very serious taxes. And I'm giving you this analysis a week before there is the autumn statement, in which we are expecting some very, very serious taxes. And I'll go into that just now. But just to tell you about the people that are imposing this upon these entrepreneurs, there are two types of financial illiterates in the United Kingdom. There are those people who, for some reason, cannot grasp the concept of cause and effect. And these people ordinarily worked in banks or the call center of banks, or indeed the technical help desk of a call center in a bank. And that's what the glass ceiling that Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor, broke through. So congratulations to her. And then the second type of person is a monkey. Okay. And that's, a macaque. You know, those monkeys that can stand on their back feet and charge, they can sprint. There's a lot of macaquing going on at the Treasury in advance, as I said, of the autumn statement next week. And we're going to see taxes on things like milkshakes. But even more bizarrely, we're going to see green taxes imposed on green things. The whole point of someone buying a Toyota Prius was that you would avoid the taxes that are imposed upon standard vehicles. But that's where they are stretching. And just to look at the data that we discovered in this little research exercise, in the year to December 2024, 250,000 people left the UK. That put a dent in migration. There are roughly 150 unicorns in Europe, a third of which are in the UK. Now, these prompt the questions to Rachel Reeves and the people in the Treasury. Did you know that you were dismantling this vital component of the economy? I assume the answer will be no. But then, even so, did you what plans have you got to replace it? Because ultimately, the entrepreneurial environment as a feature of an economy is a expression of soft power. And you can see it happening on smaller levels in places like Vietnam, in places like Thailand, in other places. Even Cape Town is on a drive there. But it is a very sad state of affairs. These things, as I said, take a very long time to build. It requires political will. In the UK, the Parliament supported this when half of it had spent their lives lobbying for people on factory floors to get them to shift from the man on the factory floor to the man behind the laptop is no mean feat. And they fostered this so well. And it's just very sad that it appears to be in retreat without any known replacement to it. I suspect that they will tell you that growth is a much broader thing. I don't believe that. I think that the perception of the economy now is that you go to the civil service for the big bucks, and that's a travesty. Those positions should be occupied by people who prioritize duty, who prioritize service, and not by people that are on the make. So, that's the conclusion that we've found, is that an entire ecosystem is in retreat, and I think it's a very sad thing. Gabriel.
Yeah, I think, France, to you?
I have a question for Simon. You know, we hear a lot of this stuff out of the UK. Along a similar line, might be a different story. The sort of broken Britain, your IPO number is really like the kind of essence of it for me. And my question to you is, you would think, as I do sitting here in one of the former colonial outposts, that there would be someone in London who would have thought through this and would have seen the consequences, and that person would have had, or group of people, or would have had influence and would have headed this off. But it just seems to compound. Why is this? Why has this happened? Why did no one see it? If they did, why did no one listen to them? And is that something that you think could change in the sort of reasonable future to think about?
In October 2023, I went to stay at the house of a friend of mine in Normandy, in France, who was a former undersecretary at the Treasury. And he's now 70 years old. And he told me an interesting story. That was 8 months before the general election of last year. And he said to me that business had stopped talking to the Conservative Party because there was no real prospect of victory in that election, and that they had gone and started talking even then to Rachel Reeves and Labour, and they had been so frightened by what they had heard that they had gone back to speak to the Conservatives, even though there was no prospect of them winning. And that, France, sort of laid, you can look at Rachel Reeves's current performance, and you see that there are multiple flaws in the way that she thinks her priorities. I'm not sure that she's even doing the thinking. You could look at the appointments that are around her. One of the key markers of financial illiteracy is the obsession with irrelevant comparison. And this Treasury often thinks of itself as a Nordic state. okay, where it is very, very obviously not. And to answer your question, how do you rehabilitate a pig-headed individual? What can you do to try and show them that there are that you are losing a really important part of your economy, that your perception around the world is being dragged through the mud? I'm not sure that this is. I think this is like, the cliff is there, but you're accelerating. And why are you accelerating? Can you even answer?
Yeah, but you haven't really helped me here, because I still don't understand how this was able to happen.
Yeah,
You'd think London was full of people. One thing I want to put to you is, when I've started looking more closely at London, one of the things we looked at was think tanks. And we were amazed at how poorly resourced they were. The Institute for Economic Affairs, the Centre for Policy Studies, relative to what I'd understood about think tanks in America. And Richard and I are together on a foundation, and we provide some support to a few groups, including now I think 2 think tanks in London. And there was just like talking to those the people that ran those organizations, there was just no, the impression they created for me was that no one cared at all about their role and importance and influence in UK society and policy. There was just no interest. And that the same had happened in a lot of the UK media. And therefore the institutions outside of politics that you would think are important in helping a society evade the kind of catastrophe that you sketch for us is in play and make it worse in the UK. That just wasn't there. Is that the problem?
Well, I suppose, but I mean, I think I did answer your question when I used the phrase pig-headedness. Okay, there's such a level of intransigence at the top of the sort of financial orthodoxy that includes the Bank of England, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility. I'm sorry here to be able to flesh out a more detailed answer without access to what the resources of those think tanks are. I just think that there is a level of intransigence, and I think maybe it's spiked with class loathing. I think it might be the idea Rachel Reeves frequently quotes is of her own upbringing. And, she was a young lady in the time of Margaret Thatcher, where there had to be a massive shift in the paradigm, privatization, and so on. And I know it wasn't perfect, but for her sort of lower, upper middle class parents to have to accommodate that, and all of the and all of the grievance that it accompanied, has laid the foundations for a bizarre perspective on how things should work here. So yeah, I'd answer your question.
So maybe why I'm struggling, maybe you did answer the question, maybe why I'm struggling is that you appear to be saying that in the UK, the politicians have actually been allowed to govern the country with their own ideas. And that sensible third parties and the like haven't intervened sufficiently to put a stop to that. And you're seeing the consequences.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention, just thinking about it now, the Conservatives did not do a good job of the economy. They just didn't. Tax burden was the highest since the Second World War, and so on. So I think that there's also a little bit of a legacy issue there, and then you also got to factor into account levels of exhaustion. But maybe I think just the numbers speak for themselves. You had 250,000 people leaving. The skills that they take with them, the business now, it doesn't get replaced.
Yeah. And on that also, was it the Henley and Partners study that was looking at liquid millionaires? Can you tell us about that, Simon?
Well, they put the study together in the wake of the scrapping of the non-domicile rule, and they made a series of predictions which didn't quite materialize, and people were going, the left-wing media here were going, oh no, these people were crying wolf and so on. Watch. They didn't put a timeline on it. They didn't say immediately. They said over the course of time. And we're going to see next week that departure syndrome being accelerated. There's no question. There are so many people are voting with their feet now, and when the entrepreneurs have done it, and what if I can finish on this point, it's criminal that Dubai has been able to poach this. It's criminal because we know what goes on in that place: crypto scamming, dark money, laundering, all sorts of stuff. And they have very clearly noted the soft power of an entrepreneurial environment and what that does to an economy. And they are going, fine, look, bring it on, because it helps us launder our image somewhat of these other things. And so you've got the UK's most prominent billionaire of a fintech, Nikolai Soronsky, who is he's renounced his Russian citizenship, but he was the son of a Gazprom executive. He was the founder of Revolut. He's in Dubai now. A friend of mine who's got a marketplace platform for wealth managers, he did very well in the UK. He's in Dubai now. A lot of people have gone there, and they're helping a place that doesn't necessarily deserve it. But you know what? Congratulations for recognizing where the UK is falling and taking advantage of it. That's all I'll say, Gabriel. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I think that fleshes out exactly what we wanted to get across there. And so we are pressed for time, but I do really want to give Richard the opportunity to talk about this point, because I think it's very important. And the topic that you're talking about, the longer we wait, the more relevant it becomes, well, half of it becomes, because I want you to explain. We didn't have you on the week of the last elections in America that saw Zoran Mamdani become mayor of New York. But there were a number of different results that happened in that election, in some of the elections across the different states. So can you take us through some of those election results? What are some of the most important? And then also, can you tell us about how Trump has responded to this and some of the policy changes he's seeking?
Yeah, so there were these off-cycle elections on I think it was the 4th of November. So these are not the midterms. The midterms are going to be coming up next November. But these sort of one-off off-cycle elections give a little indication of where the population is trending. And it's not a pretty picture for Republicans. You would not want to be a Republican in this policy environment, this sort of electoral environment. You mentioned Mamdani winning in New York. Seattle just elected another socialist to be its mayor. There were governorship elections in New Jersey and in Virginia. And those are both, New Jersey is kind of a heavily Democratic state. Virginia, more purple, more sort of mixed. The Republican that ran for the governorship in New Jersey, a guy called Jack Ciattarelli, had done extremely well, came within a hair's breadth of winning last time around. And people were quite optimistic that maybe he might pull this off, because New Jersey is a difficult place to do business in. It's expensive, high energy costs. Well, the Democrat won by, I think, 14 or 15 points, beating him, absolutely trounced him. Similarly, in Virginia, very solid win for the Democrat there against a pretty weak Republican candidate. But still, it showed a big shift away from Republicans. And this always happens with whoever's in the party opposite to who's ever in the White House or who's ever in Congress tends to do well in these kind of off-cycle elections. But it showed up in other places too. In Georgia, there's this, I think it's called the Public Service Commission, which kind of regulates the utilities there. Democrats won there too. For the first time in 20 years, the Georgians voted against the Democrats. And then there was a big issue in California. There was a ballot initiative, kind of like a referendum, on redistricting that would give the legislature their power to redistrict the electoral districts and redraw them in a way very favorable to Democrats and to get Republicans. Would put several Republican seats in California in danger. So this was a bad day for Republicans, and it was reflected What was going on? Well, largely everybody talks about affordability. Mamdani won. France pointed out that he was, when you discussed this, that he was a good candidate. He ran a good campaign, but he went on and on and on about affordability, and that's what's foremost in people's minds. The irony, of course, is that his policies will make New York much less affordable, but leave that aside. People just don't feel better off. Inflation is mostly a hangover from the Biden administration, but inflation has not come down sufficiently. Trump was re-elected because in his first term, everybody was better off. The rich got richer, the poor got richer faster and at a faster clip. That's during Biden's years, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. It's always they're always what they accuse you of. The Democrats accuse Republicans of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. In fact, it's their policies that do that. Leave that aside. This is Trump's economy, and he's being blamed. And a big issue are the tariffs that he said everybody else would pay for. He said that there's only upsides to these tariffs. Well, it turns out that I know you think I lead this very glamorous life here with personal shoppers, but I do my own shopping. I go to the supermarket and I buy things that everybody notices how expensive things are, how much less you have at the end of the month. And this is Trump's business now, and he's to blame for this. And so on that topic, they've now started to withdraw tariffs on hundreds of goods, mostly foodstuffs, where coffee and tea. Coffee's 20% more expensive now. Some of that's not his fault. There's weather issues going on, but he's slapped these tariffs on Brazil, where we get a lot of coffee from. It's distorted the market. So he's retreating on that, and I think if the logic works that in fact consumers are paying the tariffs and are worse off and will punish you at the polls, maybe this will extend to all the other tariffs that he's imposed that are destructive to our economy and limiting growth and making us all feel poorer. The other issue is on immigration. Now, Trump is very popular because of closing the southern border and stopping this completely uncontrolled immigration coming across that would happen, millions of people arriving during Biden administration. He's fixed that. But you see now, workplace rage, the immigration and customs enforcement going into the parking lot of the Home Depot, which is, sort of big hardware stores, picking up people, going into schools. I've seen this on the streets here, stopping the big white vans with contractors and arresting people, often by masked ICE agents. This is people uncomfortable, and there's something distasteful about it. Everybody wants violent gang members to be arrested, but if this is your handyman and your nanny or your cleaner, who are otherwise law-abiding, share a lot of conservative values that most Americans do, people are uncomfortable. And what we saw in these elections in Virginia and in New Jersey was a real loss in the Black and Latino votes. So this is costing them. And so as a result, Trump has started to talk a little different game. He was interviewed on Fox News and started talking about, increasing legal immigration and being more open to this. But so parting with his more hardline administration, some of the characters in his administration. So we're seeing a retreat in some areas, and maybe I support these changes. We're also, the big issue now is with every day of the Trump administration, he can't run for a third term. He becomes more of a lame duck, and are we seeing his power over the Republican Party diminish? And just yesterday, the House of Representatives and then the Senate voted to release the Epstein files. This is a big deal. I don't know what to think about these Epstein files, but he had been adamantly against releasing any the Department of Justice's files on Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Well, he's lost that, so we're seeing some interesting changes, and maybe an increasingly lame duck Trump. The question is, which wing of the Republican Party will rise? Will it be the more who will take on the MAGA mantle? The more traditional Republicans that believe in trade and limited government and low taxes. You're seeing Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, rising there. Maybe Rand Paul, the more libertarian, or the J.D. Vance wing with his more interventionist, dirigiste, less market-friendly Republicans. I don't know, but we're going to see. Interesting to watch.
First to Simon, then to France. Oh, sorry, Simon, you're muted at the moment.
Thanks.
No,
Richard, I just wanted you to try and explain very briefly how it is that a attorney general in a state can be elected despite having sent messages that he wants to kill his opponent's children. Is that really like the level? Is that the temperature? Because if it is, then it's worse then it's just as bad than with these Cat Matlala and these guys.
Yes, this was truly shocking. I did not. I couldn't believe that he won. This is a guy, just for those who don't know, this is his name is Jones, I think, who is a radical who beat a very normal centrist, successful incumbent attorney general. This is in the state of Virginia. This is truly shocking, and I think it speaks to the hatred of Trump and how divisive he has become. People will vote for someone as vile as that, who encourages violence against his opponents and their children, and that he will still win. So we have a problem. And part of this might be that there's such long early voting. People start voting in elections like a couple of months out. So I really wish we stopped this, and we should have a voting day, and you vote on that day. Because if you're voting 2 months before, and then the revelations come out that the person you've cast your vote for is a violence-loving psychopath, we're not having the same elections. These are different elections going on over 2 months. So so that might be part of the problem with early elections. But it is shocking. I have no explanation for you other than it's bad.
France, so you still want to say something?
Yeah. Can the sort of old school Republicans come back, Richard? And
Well, that's
how?
what we're going to see. I don't know. I mean, we're seeing that in the Senate, the more sort of traditional Republicans who I would identify much more with than the MAG ones, trying to do this, but it's going to be tough. And we're seeing. We still have the hangover of the fight that we spoke about before with the Heritage Foundation, with the Groypers. There was a prominent board member of Heritage just resigned, Robbie George, because he's unhappy there. So I don't know. This is going to be a nasty fight, and I'm hoping that they do, but it remains to be seen. I don't know the answer.
And very briefly, Richard, can you just tell us what Trump wants to do to change the election policies? Because I don't think you covered that in your answer, but it was the second part of my question.
Well, I mean, the election policies are run by the state, and the federal government doesn't really have a role to say in this. Every state and local authorities run their elections, and that is in our constitution. So Trump can complain about this all he wants, but he doesn't have much of a say here, and so that's why you're seeing at the state level, Texas did this with its sort of gerrymandering its districts, and that's actually there's been a negative court ruling on that just a couple of days ago. And California is trying to do the same, but he has very little power over elections. So he can complain about it all he likes, but he doesn't have that much power.
Can you explain a point you made that Trump becomes a lame duck? Just explain how that happens and what the implications are.
Well, I mean, with every day that passes, he becomes less and less relevant. In his if you're a president and you're facing you have a second term open to you, you still have power over the party's direction. but with every day that passes, your power diminishes because you can't run again. You're going to go off into the sunset, and I don't know what he's going to do, but their power diminishes, and so that's why you're seeing these different factions rising up and trying to exert their control over the direction of policy. And it seems like Trump is trying to retreat from some of his key policy issues, like tariffs. I hope. I don't think this might not happen, but I hope he loses in the Supreme Court and takes that almost as a win and allows them to stop this tariff policy that is proving to be so destructive to our economic growth. You can't invest when you have no idea whether the inputs you're going to be facing are going to be 10% or 100% or 50% higher in the next week, because on a whim the president decides he doesn't like an advertisement that Canadians have run here, so he just slaps on an extra 10%. That is not how you successfully grow an economy, and I think he's hearing this now. But he needs to have a sort of face-saving retreat. I hope that the Supreme Court delivers that to him, but I'm not sure it will. But so to get back to your question, his power diminishes. I'm not going to count him out, because people have at their cost predicted the demise of Donald Trump for many, many, many years. He's still a huge force. He's taken over the Republican Party and remade it in his image, but that will inevitably diminish. And
James?
Yeah.
It just a sort of add-on point isn't there also a lesson in politics that it's quite dangerous to solve the problems that you campaigned on, like with illegal immigration, which he has done, because people sort of bank that and then they move on to other concerns.
Yeah.
And I think it was Machiavelli who said, or he was quoting someone else, said, gratitude is a burden, but revenge is a pleasure. So voters are probably grateful that he did solve a number of issues which are, I think, of acute concern to Americans, but now they've got other issues, and that's now in a way a problem for the Republicans.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a huge problem, and I certainly have been a fan of a lot of Trump's foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East and his dealing with Iran. But people don't vote on that. They look at the news and they're happy that the United States looks strong and our enemies are put in their place. But they've got to fill up the car and they've got to buy food, and nobody feels wealthy. People just don't feel like they're getting wealthy or advancing. And there was the Journal after this election. I think it was a voter in New Jersey, a lifelong Republican, who said she voted for the Democrats because she's just exhausted. It's this non-stop, constant turmoil with Trump every single day. Politics shouldn't play such a big role in our lives. It never used to. It should have its place. We should be much more interested in going to football and going to church and doing everything else. But politics has become all powerful, all-encompassing, and it's exhausting, and people are sick of it. And so that's why this lifelong Republican voted for the Democrat. That's why I say I would not want to be a Republican looking for office. And if in the next November, in the midterms, as it will likely happen, they will lose the House of Representatives. They only have a 4 or 5 seat majority there. I can look forward to whatever good policies, and there are some good policies coming out of the Trump administration, will be just halted by non-stop impeachment efforts and inquiries, and it'll be messy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. I think that's a great place to leave it. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've traveled through Simon, last word in, then to Richard. Okay, Simon, then to Richard, then we're done.
Now that we've finished, I just wanted to say well done to both you and France for that excellent the polling, but also to France and James, just to remember that we're nearly a month away from a decade since Jacob Zuma fire in Nhlanhlanene and the chaos that ensued. We're talking about Marcus here, and I've written something for France this week. But I remember, James, that you published an excellent article by Rion Milan called "Going the Full Mugabe," which was really, really good at the time. But if you're looking for markers from where we've been to where we are, I think that's something to remember.
Richard?
I just wanted to say that despite the fact that you always make fun of the lack of hair, none of us, except for Simon, have commented at all on that fungus growing on your lip, and I'd like to congratulate us.
The amazing
collectively.
thing, Richard, is that I mean, Gabriel's camera must be extremely good that you could see it.
Yes.
We've been remarking around the editorial table this morning that I pointed out to people that Gabriel says he's growing a moustache, if they haven't noticed. So
I think getting back to OnlyFans, it's a very porn star like-ish moustache that you're working on. Good luck. Keep it going.
Well, at least you know you won't get debanked for it.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, I'll have you know, Richard, that by growing this, I've single-handedly solved all men's mental health issues. So that is the burden that you're feeling off your shoulders, gentlemen.
you.
That's me and this fungus. So, well, I was gonna say that we started with and went through, spent a long time on polling on South Africa, and that we told you about where the political parties stand, what's causing this position, and where the country is likely to go. Then Simon, you took us through a great piece on the South Africa, the United Kingdom's market position and why it's a hellscape for entrepreneurs, and we ended with Richard explaining the American election results and where that country is likely to go. And so, thank you so much to the ladies and gentlemen for making it this far, and tune in again next week for another episode of South Africa's Best News Podcast. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.